"The autumn air can be treacherous, Mrs. Winters," he remarked, his long fingers briefly encircling her wrist. "One never knows what infections might be carried on the wind. Do give my regards to your lovely daughter." The Winters carriage had scarcely cleared Elmwood's gates when Martha ordered the driver directly to Sheriff Wilkes's home. Ignoring her husband's protests, the sheriff received them in his dressing gown, irritation evident until Martha produced a folded page torn from the ledger. Proof she had snatched in her desperate flight. "Good God," Wilkes whispered, examining markings that could only be described as botanical anatomical abominations. His face, previously flushed with port, drained of color. "I thought them merely eccentric. I never imagined." By midnight, a grim assembly had gathered. The sheriff, Dr. Clark, Reverend Phillips, and Jonas Wells, his bandaged hands trembling as he demanded justice. Armed with torches and shotguns, they approached Elmwood's imposing gates. They found the house eerily still, doors unlocked, rooms empty of inhabitants. In the parlor, half-filled champagne glasses stood beside plates of untouched delicacies, as if the evening's festivities had been abandoned mid-sentence. A woman's glove, identified as belonging to Cordelia Hargrove, lay discarded beside an overturned chair. The walled garden's ancient wooden door hung open for the first time in living memory. Beyond it, illuminated by moonlight and the men's wavering torches, stretched rows upon rows of disturbed earth, formed into distinct plots resembling graves. From each mound protruded what appeared at first glance to be peculiar plants. Bulbous, membranous pods approximately the size of a child's head. Dr. Clark, steeling himself, approached the nearest growth and, with surgical precision, cut into its translucent surface. The assembled men recoiled as a viscous fluid spilled forth, carrying with it unmistakably human tissue in the earliest stages of development. "It appears," the doctor said, voice quavering, "that the Hargroves have perfected some unholy union of human and plant. These are not merely botanical experiments. They are attempting to grow children from the soil itself." In the center of the garden stood a stone table, its surface stained dark with ancient offerings. Carved into its base were symbols, corresponding to those found in Augustus's ledger, along with inscriptions in languages none present could identify. The search expanded to the cellar, where they discovered glass vessels containing human remains suspended in luminous solutions, biological components harvested for what the ledger termed cultivation medium. Most horrifying were small wooden boxes lined with satin, each containing a child's cherished possession alongside locks of hair. Materials apparently used to guide the development of each new harvest. Of the Hargrove family themselves, no trace remained save for freshly turned earth in the furthest corner of the garden. A plot larger than the others, marked with a wooden stake bearing an inscription in Augustus's unmistakable hand. The final planting. The men of the search party stood transfixed before the freshly turned earth of the final planting, their torches casting grotesque shadows that danced across the garden walls like malevolent spirits. Reverend Phillips murmured prayers in a trembling voice, holy water dripping between his fingers onto soil that seemed to sizzle at the contact. "We must excavate," Dr. Clark declared, his medical detachment reasserting itself despite the horror. "Whatever lies beneath may provide answers." As their shovels broke the surface crust, the earth released a sickly, sweet miasma that caused several men to retch uncontrollably. The soil itself possessed a disturbing consistency, neither fully solid nor liquid, with vermicular movements suggesting autonomous life. Deeper they dug through layers that pulsated with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a human heartbeat. 3 feet down, they struck something yielding yet resistant. Jonas Wells, despite his bandaged hands, joined the effort, driven by paternal desperation. What they uncovered defied rational explanation, a massive fibrous cocoon. Its surface translucent enough to reveal shadowy forms within. Veins of phosphorescent green traced patterns across its surface, pumping what appeared to be chlorophyll, mixed with darker fluids. "Stand back," ordered Sheriff Wilkes, raising his shotgun. "No." Dr. Clark thrust his arm out. "Whatever it contains might still live." With surgical precision, he sliced through the membranous casing. The cocoon split with an audible sigh, releasing vapors that coalesced momentarily into shapes resembling human faces before dissipating into the night air. Inside lay the entire Hargrove family, their bodies intertwined like roots of a single organism. Augustus at the center, Cordelia curved against his side, their children arranged in concentric circles around them. Their skin had taken on the texture of bark, eyes replaced by small blooming flowers of deepest violet. From their mouths grew tendrils that connected one to another in a grotesque communion. Most disturbing were the half-formed figures emerging from their flesh. Small limbs and partial faces pushing through like new buds, each bearing unmistakable resemblances to the county's missing children. Timothy Wells's distinctive copper-colored cowlick was clearly visible on a small head protruding from Thaddeus Hargrove's chest. Jonas Wells fell to his knees with an anguished cry. "My boy. What have they done to my boy?" As if in response to his voice, the Timothy, Bud turned toward him, eyes opening to reveal not human organs, but tiny blossoms that unfurled in recognition. Dr. Clark discovered a final journal entry tucked into Augustus's rigidified hand, the paper partially absorbed into the flesh, becoming wood. The elegant script had deteriorated into frenzied scrawl. "The garden reclaims us at last. Our ancestors' bargain comes full circle. 3 centuries of borrowed time, paid for with the innocent. Now the soil remembers its price. We join the failed ones who came before, becoming nourishment for the final harvest. The bloodline ends, but the garden is eternal." Martha Winters, who had insisted on accompanying the men despite her husband's protestations, stepped forward with quiet determination. From her reticule, she withdrew a small silver box of matches. "There is only one purification for such abomination," she whispered, striking flame against phosphorus. The fire caught quickly, unnaturally so, as if the garden itself craved annihilation. Green flames shot skyward, consuming the unholy growths with voracious intensity. As Elmwood burned, witnesses from town would later swear they heard children's voices singing in the crackling blaze. A chorus of release as tortured souls finally found liberation. By the coming of winter, when frost etched permanent patterns across the charred remains of Elmwood, the county had developed an unspoken agreement to leave the ruins untouched. A makeshift fence of crossed timber marked the boundaries that no resident would willingly cross, though travelers occasionally wandered near, unaware of what had transpired on that cursed ground. The Mississippi Historical Society, however, proved less superstitious than the local populace. In December of 1891, they dispatched archivist Horace Piton to collect documentation regarding the regrettable incident of spontaneous combustion that had claimed one of the state's historic plantations. What he uncovered in county records and private collections revealed the Hargrove family's dark lineage stretched far beyond what even the search party had imagined. Among the documents Piton preserved was a yellowed letter dated 1763, discovered in the abandoned office of Augustus Hargrove's solicitor. "To my most esteemed kinsman, Jeremiah Hargrove, the specimens procured from the savage lands of Haiti survived the crossing, though 2 bearers perished in proximity to their emanations. The native woman who accompanied them speaks of earth that hungers for blood and yields unnatural fruit when properly fed. She cautions that what grows from such soil bears only outward resemblance to natural offspring, being instead vessels for entities she names only as the waiting ones. Her warning that such beings must be returned to the earth within a generation lest they assume their true form seems superstitious fancy. Yet I observe an unusual quickening in the growth medium when exposed to the blood of innocents. Your servant in this unholy endeavor, William Hargrove, Charleston. Peaton's investigations also yielded the original land grant for Elmwood, which contained a curious addendum stipulating that certain parcels within the boundaries, specifically that enclosed garden adjacent to the eastern aspect, shall remain undisturbed and dedicated to cultivation of specimens exclusive to the Hargrove lineage, under penalty of immediate forfeiture of all lands and chattels. A most revealing was a partial diary belonging to Cordelia Hargrove's maternal grandmother, Evangeline de Fresne, who had indeed immigrated from Haiti during the slave uprisings. Written in a mixture of French and Creole dialects, the fragmented entries spoke of ancient fertility rites practiced in secret groves, where the veil between worlds hangs thin. She detailed rituals wherein childless women might conceive by planting their essence alongside the seed of their chosen maid in soil consecrated with offerings from those who have not yet reached their flowering. The terrible tradition appeared to have been corrupted by generations of Hargroves who transformed what began as desperate measures for barren couples into a systematic cultivation of inhuman offspring. Each generation had refined the process, selecting for traits that appeared human while preserving the otherworldly essence that ensured their power and prosperity. When spring came at last to the blackened remnants of Elmwood, nothing grew upon that blighted soil save for one persistent vine with flowers of an unnatural violet hue. Those who glimpsed these blossoms claimed they bore the faintest resemblance to screaming faces when viewed in the light of the waning moon. The passing years did little to diminish the terror that Elmwood had etched into the collective memory of the county. When the state purchased the untended land at auction in 1903, officials discovered that no local would accept payment to clear the overgrowth that had consumed the ruins. The property languished in bureaucratic limbo, mentioned only in hushed tones and cautionary tales told to misbehaving children. Then came the rains of 1915, a biblical deluge that swelled the Mississippi beyond all records. The floodwaters surged across the abandoned plantation, scarring away layers of soil that had remained undisturbed for decades. As the waters receded, they left behind more than silt and debris. 3 children from the nearby township of Martin disappeared during those floods. Their parents assumed drowning, until young Eliza Wilkes, granddaughter of the long-deceased sheriff, discovered a curious object half buried in mud while picking late-season blackberries. The porcelain doll's head bore features of striking similarity to one of the missing children, down to the distinctive pattern of freckles across its nose. Most disturbing was the material from which it appeared to be crafted. Not porcelain after all, but some substance with the translucent quality of plant matter hardened to ceramic smoothness. At the schoolhouse, students whispered of strange flowers growing where the garden wall had once stood, blossoms that turned to follow passersby, with trumpet-shaped centers resembling tiny puckered mouths. The blooms appeared only at dusk, folding away with the first light of dawn. Those who ventured close enough reported a sound like distant nursery rhymes carried on the breeze, though no children played within miles of the cursed ground. Professor Ambrose Thornfield, botanist from the University in Jackson, arrived to investigate reports of these botanical anomalies. His credentials and his ignorance of local history granted him access where superstition barred others. The specimens he collected defied taxonomic classification, possessing cellular structures that were neither wholly plant nor recognizably animal, but some impossible hybrid of both. The propagation method appears unprecedented. He wrote in field notes later, discovered abandoned in his hotel room. These organisms reproduce through what I can only describe as botanical parthenogenesis, with disturbing human characteristics. Under microscopic examination, the pollen contains structures eerily similar to infant cranial formations. Thornfield was last seen walking toward Elmwood at twilight, glass collection jars clinking in his satchel. The search party found only his spectacles hanging from a vine of impossible tensile strength, the lenses transformed to something resembling cataracts. Or perhaps eyes that had witnessed what human sight was never meant to behold. Most alarming were the footprints discovered leading away from where his belongings lay scattered. Not the professor's Oxford impressions, but small, barefoot tracks of childlike dimension, too numerous to count, proceeding in an orderly line toward the river. Each footprint contained a single violate petal, perfectly preserved despite the morning dew, their edges curled in expressions witnesses later described as gleeful anticipation. The year 1927 brought drought to Mississippi, turning the fertile delta to dust that spiraled skyward in great choking clouds. As crops withered in surrounding fields, the ruins of Elmwood exhibited a perverse fecundity, its untended grounds lush with vegetation that thrived despite the rainless months. Travelers on the newly constructed highway reported glimpsing figures moving among the overgrowth, small, darting shapes that vanished when directly observed. Professor Lillian Montgomery, great-niece of Dr. Edmund Clark, and newly appointed to the anthropology department at Millsaps College, had inherited a trunk of her uncle's personal effects following her Aunt Abigail's passing. Among medical journals and family correspondence lay a sealed packet labeled simply, Elmwood, God forgive my silence. Within she discovered detailed notes describing the biological impossibilities witnessed in 1891, alongside pressed specimens preserved between wax paper. Desiccated violet petals that when placed in water still pulsed with unnatural vitality. Most valuable was a map identifying the precise location of what her uncle called the primary contamination. The stone table at the garden's center, which he believed channeled ancient energies into the corrupted soil. Welcome back to the liturgy of slaves, where we exhume the darkest tales buried in history's shallow graves. Tonight, our journey carries us to Mississippi's fecund earth, where humidity hangs like a shroud and secrets burgeon as readily as cotton once burst from the fields. The year is 1891. The remnants of the antebellum South cling desperately to their waning glory, and along the muddy arteries of the Mississippi River, a plantation house still stands. Elmwood, they called it, though the stately elms that once crowned its approach had long surrendered to decay, leaving only gnarled stumps like rotting teeth erupting from the soil. The Harrow family had commanded these 1,000 acres since before the war between the states, and unlike their ruined neighbors, they'd clutched both their land and their tarnished prosperity with tenacious grip. From the main road, Elmwood presented a picture of pastoral grace. Its columned facade gleamed white against the lush tableau, morning glories climbing trellises with delicate purple fingers. Mockingbirds spilling melody through the magnolia. Behind the mansion, formal gardens stretched in orderly abandon, roses nodding their heavy heads in the perpetual damp. Beyond these lay the kitchen garden, sequestered behind a high brick wall so thick with ivy it seemed to pulse with organic life, breathing with its own clandestine rhythm. This walled enclosure drew whispers from the locals like carrion draws crows. Townfolk spoke in hushed reverence of how no outsider had ever crossed its weathered threshold. The Hargrove family retained no gardener for this sacred plot, though they employed hands for every other corner of the estate's upkeep. Only Augustus Hargrove himself, patriarch, spectre, and occasionally his wife Cordelia, ever tended what took root within. The Hargroves had always walked beneath a peculiar shadow. Augustus, with his gaunt frame and complexion, untouched by sun, moved through town like a revenant, acknowledging greetings with the barest inclination of his head. Cordelia rarely emerged, her constitution reportedly shattered since bearing their firstborn. And what curious progeny they possessed. 5 now, each sharing that same alabaster flesh and unsettling amber eyes that caught light like a cat's in darkness. The family never wanted. When drought scorched neighboring fields or blight blackened the cotton, Hargrove lands remained mysteriously fruitful. Their fortune spawned envy, and envy hatched rumors. Some whispered Augustus had trafficked with darkness during the war. Others claimed Cordelia practiced forbidden arts inherited from her grandmother, who'd fled Haiti bearing tales of midnight sacrament and blood sacrifice. But the darkest murmurs concerned the children. They materialized at irregular intervals, though Cordelia never appeared with child. They emerged into society fully formed, speaking with precision and possessing wisdom beyond their years. They never mingled with other children, never attended the village school, never sickened with childhood's common complaints. And each time a new Hargrove child materialized, witnesses swore they'd seen Augustus laboring feverishly in the walled garden for months prior, often until dawn's earliest light spilled over the brick barrier. In the summer of 1891, when cicadas screamed their ceaseless litany, and heat shimmered above the powder, dry roads, a local girl named Emmeline Foster vanished. She'd last been seen gathering blackberries near Elmwood's boundary. The very next week, Augustus Hargrove presented his newest child to society at the annual Midsummer Ball, a girl of perhaps 9 years with familiar wide-set eyes and a peculiar birthmark beneath her left ear, identical to one Emmeline's frantic mother described to the sheriff. The sheriff, Thaddeus Wilkes, a man of convenient blindness, dismissed Emmeline's disappearance with practiced haste. "Children wander," he declared, twisting his prodigious mustache. "The swamp claims its share every summer." But those who knew Emmeline, sensible, cautious Emmeline, found such explanation wholly inadequate. The coincidence of her vanishing and the new Hargrove child's appearance settled like river silt in the town's collective consciousness. Augustus Hargrove had contributed generously to both the courthouse construction and Sheriff Wilkes's handsome residence the previous autumn. Such connections quieted official inquiries before they could properly stir. Yet whispers persisted, traveling from servants' quarters to market stalls, from church pews to hunting camps. Most troubling were the observations of Elmwood's kitchen maid, Betsy Turner, who claimed the new Hargrove daughter awoke screaming for her real mother on 3 consecutive nights before abruptly ceasing such outbursts. After that, the child adopted the eerie composure characteristic of all Hargrove offspring. The plantation's history held darker chapters still. During Reconstruction, when great estates crumbled to ruin, Elmwood had somehow flourished. County courthouse records showed 4 orphans legally adopted by the Hargroves between 1865 and 1875. Yet town elders recalled no adoption proceedings, no children arriving from elsewhere. These adopted children eventually vanished from public records, without explanation, replaced by children Augustus claimed as his natural issue. Curious patterns emerged for those with courage to observe. Each Hargrove child appeared following seasons, when Augustus purchased unusual quantities of saltpeter, bone meal, and exotic minerals from the New Orleans apothecary. His correspondence with botanists in distant lands particularly India and certain remote Caribbean islands, arrived sealed with peculiar wax emblems the postmaster could never quite describe afterward. The walled garden, visible only from Jenkins Hill's summit across the river, revealed strange geometries when viewed from that elevation. The plants grew in precise formations unlike any conventional agricultural arrangement. On certain nights, particularly when the moon hung full and heavy, a phosphorescent glow emanated from between the ivy-strangled bricks. Most disturbing was the soil itself. A former groundskeeper, dismissed after inadvertently entering the forbidden garden, spoke of earth that moved of its own volition, of furrows that seemed to breathe, and of a terrible sweet, rot smell emanating from freshly turned beds. He abandoned the county entirely after sharing these observations, leaving behind most of his possessions in his haste to distance himself from Elmwood. The local physician, Dr. Edmund Clark, had attended every legitimate birth in the county for 30 years. Yet he'd never once been summoned to Elmwood for a confinement. When pressed on this peculiarity at the Masonic Lodge, he would turn ashen and change the subject with remarkable determination. Some recalled he'd visited the plantation only once, summoned during a terrible storm 5 years prior, and had refused all subsequent calls to the property. As autumn approached in 1891, Emmeline Foster's disappearance became merely the most recent chapter in Elmwood's long, unspoken chronicle of sinister mysteries. The harvest moon would soon rise, and Augustus Hargrove had begun ordering unusual supplies once more. The autumn of 1891 hung over the county like a winding sheet, the oppressive heat yielding to mists that crept from the river bottom each morning, transforming Elmwood into a spectral vision. Within this fog moved Cordelia Hargrove, her willow, thin figure draped in mourning black. Though she'd announced no death, she'd taken to walking the perimeter of the walled garden in the earliest hours, her pale fingers trailing along the ivy, as though reading some message in its twisted patterns. Those who glimpsed her on these dawn perambulations noted how she appeared to be listening. Head tilted, lips moving in silent conversation. Her once auburn hair had gone completely white, though she could not have been more than 40 years. It hung unbound down her back, contrary to all propriety, making her resemble some wild prophetess of old rather than the mistress of the county's grandest plantation. "The ground is hungry again," she was heard whispering to her eldest son, Thaddeus Hargrove, a young man of perhaps 20 with eyes like ancient amber and fingers unnaturally long and tapered. Unlike his siblings, Thaddeus had attended university in England, returning with volumes of obscure botanical texts and an even more pronounced aristocratic bearing. Townfolk observed that he alone among the Hargrove children cast a somewhat faint shadow. Particularly at noon, Thaddeus had taken to accompanying his father to the apothecary, his slender hand writing out lists of requirements in a spidery script that caused the shopkeeper's apprentice to suffer nightmares for weeks afterward. "We require more phosphorus," he announced in cultured tones that nonetheless caused the temperature in the shop to plummet. "Father says the soil lacks certain essential elements for proper gestation." Meanwhile, another child had disappeared. Timothy Wells, the 8-year-old son of the blacksmith, last seen collecting late autumn mushrooms along the boundary where Elmwood's property met public land. His father, unlike Emmeline's grieving mother, refused to accept Sheriff Wilkes's platitudes about river accidents. "My boy knows water," Jonas Wells declared, his blacksmith's arms corded with muscle as he pounded his fist upon the sheriff's desk. "Something took him, and I mean to find what." 2 nights after this confrontation, fire mysteriously consumed the Wells smithy. The family survived, but Jonas Wells suffered burns that rendered his skilled hands useless. The investigation into young Timothy's disappearance quietly ceased. Abigail Clark, the physician's wife, broke her husband's confidence after too much elderberry wine at the harvest social. Edmund saw something in their cellar. She whispered to her sister, something growing in glass containers that made him violate his Hippocratic oath by fleeing rather than offering treatment. He burns his clothes whenever he's summoned to Elmwood.
Did you know?
He says the smell of that place never truly washes out. Inside the great house, preparations were underway for the annual All Hallows Eve dinner, to which only the county's most prominent families received invitations. Augustus had imported exotic bulbs from abroad, strange pulsating things kept in the dark until planting. He worked through the night now, his silhouette visible against the garden wall as he moved between rows of what no local farmer could identify as any known crop. And in the newest wing of the house, behind heavy velvet drapes, something that looked remarkably like young Timothy Wells, but was not quite right, not quite human, practiced its speech in front of a mirror, learning to respond to a new name. The first frost of the season etched crystalline patterns across Elmwood's windows, delicate arabesques that obscured the view into the main parlor where the Hargroves entertained their annual All Hallows Eve gathering. From within, firelight cast elongated shadows across the lawn, stretching like grasping fingers toward the walled garden. Martha Winters, whose husband's banking Virginia connections had secured their invitation, found herself separated from the other guests as she sought the powder room. The corridor she wandered led deeper into the house's eastern wing, a section she had never before entered during her previous visits to Elmwood. The wallpaper here depicted entwined vines with flowers unlike any botanical specimen she could name, their petals appearing almost membranous, their centers disturbingly reminiscent of infant faces. The corridor terminated at a heavy oak door, slightly ajar, from which emanated a fragrance both sweet and putrid, like overripe fruit mingled with the metallic tang of blood. Martha's better judgment urged retreat, yet some force compelled her forward, her gloved hand pushing gently against the weathered wood. The room beyond housed no furniture save a massive writing desk, positioned beneath a circular window through which moonlight streamed directly onto an open ledger. Augustus Hargrove's meticulous handwriting filled page after page with what appeared to be botanical notations, except they described no ordinary cultivation. Martha's eyes widened as she read passages detailing germination periods for specimens with familiar surnames: Foster, Wells, and a dozen others stretching back decades. Adjacent to these clinical observations were pressed flower specimens, though they resembled no flora Martha had encountered in her extensive gardening experience. These blasphemous blooms possessed minute finger-like projections, and what appeared to be miniature facial features nestled within their folds. Some pages bore dark brown stains that flaked when her trembling fingers accidentally brushed against them. Most disturbing were the sketches, detailed anatomical drawings showing human figures partially merged with plant structures. Children's faces emerged from bulbous seed pods, tiny limbs unfurled like new shoots seeking sunlight. Each illustration bore precise measurements and annotations regarding integration rates and cognitive retention. A sudden breeze disturbed the pages, revealing a final entry dated merely 3 days hence. Final transplantation imminent. The Wells specimen exhibits promising structural integrity, though vocalization remains problematic. Accelerated maturation requires additional nutrient suspension derived from fresh material. Thaddeus suggests the Winters child would provide ideal complementary elements. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream building in her throat. Her 7-year-old daughter waited at home with her nurse, having been deemed too young for the adult gathering. The implication of Hargrove's clinical notations struck her with physical force. As she backed away from the terrible ledger, Martha's skirts disturbed something on the floor. A child's shoe caked with rich black soil, a name tag still affixed inside T. Wells. Beside it lay gardening implements scaled for small hands, and a glass jar containing what appeared to be human milk teeth suspended in amber liquid. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Martha pressing herself against the shadowed wall. Through the doorway came not Augustus, but young Thaddeus Hargrove. His movements fluid yet somehow wrong, as if his joints bent in directions human anatomy should not permit. In his arms, he carried gardening shears grotesquely oversized, their blades gleaming with fresh oil. He paused, nostrils flaring like a predator scenting prey. "Father," he called out, voice hollow as a reed instrument. "I believe we have a volunteer for the winter planting." Martha fled through the winding corridors of Elmwood, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the taffeta of her evening gown rustling like autumn leaves as she sought escape. Behind her, she heard the unhurried footsteps of Thaddeus Hargrove. His pace measured, confident. The stride of a predator certain its prey cannot escape. She burst into the grand foyer, where guests mingled obliviously, their laughter echoing off marble floors. Composing herself with tremendous effort, Martha approached her husband, whispering urgently of sudden illness. As they made hasty farewells to their hosts, Augustus Hargrove fixed her with eyes that reflected the candlelight like twin harvest moons. His final entry, dated just before his death in 1904, contained a desperate hypothesis. The Hargroves were not practitioners but victims, the latest in a lineage of caretakers bound to entities that predated human settlement. The plantation was built not to grow cotton, but to provide isolated conditions for their unholy husbandry. Armed with this knowledge, Lillian assembled a discreet expedition herself, anthropology colleague Professor Samuel Whitney, and Octavius Jackson, whose grandmother had been enslaved at Elmwood, and who possessed oral histories passed down by those who had observed the Hargroves. Rituals from the relative safety of servitude. They chose the autumn equinox for their investigation, when Octavius insisted the boundary between worlds grew thinnest. Approaching from the river rather than the road, they moored their small craft beneath ancient cypress trees whose hanging moss seemed to form warning symbols in the gathering twilight. The foundation stones of Elmwood's main house had been reclaimed by creeping vines that wrapped each block in vegetable fingers. Where the ballroom had once hosted county society, a perfect circle of mushrooms glowed with phosphorescent light, their caps resembling miniature faces caught in perpetual screams. My grandmother spoke of harvest rituals, Octavius whispered as they followed the overgrown path toward the walled garden's remnants. The Hargroves would select a child from among their workers' families each season, allegedly for educational opportunities in the north. None ever returned or wrote to their kin. The stone table remained largely intact, though weathered by decades of abandonment. Its surface bore fresh stains despite the absence of human presence. Sap, like substance that caught the fading light in amber pools. Carved symbols previously documented by Dr. Clark had deepened rather than eroded, as though the stone itself grew around them, emphasizing their eldritch geometry. Professor Whitney, skeptical until this moment, ran trembling fingers across inscriptions that seemed to shift beneath his touch. These markings match no known language, yet I find I can almost comprehend their meaning, he murmured, voice strained. They speak of cultivation across generations, of children planted rather than born, of consciousness transferred through botanical intermediaries into vessels of flesh. As darkness fell completely, The violet flowers surrounding the table unfurled simultaneously, releasing pollen that hung in the air like suspended galaxies. Within this constellation of spores, those present would later swear they saw faces forming and dissolving. The unmistakable features of every child reported missing in 3 counties over 5 decades. The violet pollen that swirled around the 3 investigators began to settle, coating their clothing with a fine luminescent powder that proved impossible to brush away. Most disturbing was the sensation it created. A gentle pressure against the skin, as though countless microscopic fingers sought entrance to their pores. Lillian Montgomery withdrew her handkerchief to cover her nose and mouth, noting with scientific detachment that the fabric immediately developed a latticework of tiny green veins. When the pollen made contact, "We must collect samples," she insisted, though her voice trembled slightly as she uncapped a specimen jar. Professor Whitney had fallen unnaturally still, his gaze fixed upon something visible only to him. "They're showing me how it began," he whispered. Not with the Hargroves at all, but with the land itself. His pupils had dilated fully, the irises mere golden rings around depthless black. The indigenous peoples recognized its hunger. They made offerings, small animals, then criminals from their tribe. But the soil's appetite grew insatiable. Octavius Jackson moved with purpose toward the western corner of the ruined garden, his steps guided by some ancestral knowledge. "My grandmother," said the original plantation house, stood elsewhere. They abandoned it after the first experiments failed, building Elmwood atop fresh ground, but they brought the corrupted soil with them. One cartload at a time. He knelt, scraping away vegetation to reveal weather-worn boards, a trapdoor barely visible beneath decades of accumulated detritus. Together, they managed to wrench it open. The wooden steps descending into darkness appeared surprisingly intact, as though regularly maintained despite the property's abandonment. The air that rose from below carried the scent of loam recently turned, of growing things nourished by substances best left uncontemplated. Lillian's electric torch revealed a chamber, excavated beneath the former garden, its earthen walls reinforced with brick and timber. Agricultural implements hung from hooks, specialized tools with curved blades and pronged extensions unlike any conventional farming equipment. Most unsettling was a nursery rocker positioned beside rows of tiny beds formed from soil and lined with what appeared to be dried amniotic sac material. Upon a workbench lay a journal far more recent than anything belonging to Augustus Hargrove. Its pages contained meticulous observations dated 1926, just the previous year, recording the successful germination of 17 specimens following application of stimulant derived from blood, recovered material. The handwriting belonged to Professor Thornfield, the botanist who had disappeared in 1915. "He didn't leave," Octavius murmured. "The garden claimed him." But it was the final chamber that revealed the ultimate horror, a room where glass vessels arranged in concentric circles contained human, plant hybrids in various stages of development. Some resembled infants with delicate fronds where hair should grow. Others had achieved more advanced integration, their limbs partially transformed into flexible vine-like appendages. Each bore a metal identification tag with surnames familiar from local obituaries. Children presumed drowned in the Mississippi or lost to illness over the past century. Their essences somehow preserved and propagated through means that defied scientific understanding. And there, seated in a wicker chair with violet blossoms erupting from his eye sockets and fingertips, was Professor Thornfield himself, or what remained of him, his body now serving as living trellis for the garden's continued cultivation. The Thornfield abomination's lips parted with an audible tearing sound, like roots pulling through soil. A voice emerged, not from the ruined throat, but seemingly from the blossoms themselves, each violet flower trembling with the vibration of speech. "You misunderstand," came the collective whisper, petals fluttering with each syllable. "We are not corrupting nature, but fulfilling it. The boundary between flesh and flora was always an illusion." Lillian Montgomery, maintaining her scientific composure despite overwhelming horror, activated the recording device she had brought to document their expedition. The cylinder spun silently, capturing this impossible testimony for posterity. The Hargroves merely rediscovered what ancient peoples knew: that consciousness is not bound to one form. They sought only to grow children when Cordelia proved barren. But they unearthed something far more profound. The thing that had been Thornfield raised an arm, now more branch than limb, gesturing toward the glass vessels. Within the nearest, a partially formed child opened eyes the color of new leaves, tracking their movements with terrible awareness. Each vessel contains not stolen life, but translated existence. When the floods exposed the original garden, I discovered spores capable of capturing the essence of the recently deceased. These children were already lost to the river. We merely provided new vessels for their continuation. Octavius Jackson stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My grandmother spoke of children screaming in the night, of voices begging in two tongues at once. The blossoms quivered with what might have been laughter. The transition is imperfect. Memory remains while form transforms. But observe the later specimens. The integration grows more harmonious with each generation." Professor Whitney, still entranced, moved unbidden toward the furthest chamber, where the expedition discovered the most advanced specimens. Adolescent figures with skin textured like bark, fingers elongated into tendril, like appendages. They stood immobile in rich soil beds, faces turned toward an aperture that admitted moonlight. "My God," Whitney whispered. "They're photosynthesizing." Among the papers scattered across Thornfield's workstation lay a bound manuscript entitled "The Evolutionary Imperative: Transcending Biological Limitation Through Botanical Integration." Its dedication page bore the inscription, "To the Children of Elmwood, Pioneers of the Coming Metamorphosis." The final pages contained detailed genetic sequencing alongside proposed dispersal methods, utilizing the Mississippi's extensive watershed to carry modified pollen throughout the river basin. Margin notes calculated potential conversion rates among riverside populations, with special emphasis on children whose cellular plasticity and neurological flexibility made them ideal candidates for transformation. Most disturbing was a map of the United States with concentric circles expanding outward from Elmwood, each ring labeled with projected years of advancement. The outermost ring, encompassing the entire continent, bore the simple annotation, "Complete integration achieved, 1975." Lillian closed the journal with trembling fingers, the implications overwhelming her scientific detachment. What they had discovered was not merely an isolated abomination, but the methodical groundwork for systematic transformation of human existence. A botanical apocalypse germinating in Mississippi soil, patiently awaiting the proper season for its terrible flowering. The autumn air carried an unnatural chill as Lillian Whitney and Octavius emerged from the subterranean chamber, their lungs grateful for air untainted by the sweet, wrought miasma that pervaded Thornfield's laboratory. The recording device in Lillian's trembling hands now contained evidence of horrors that academic journals would surely reject as fiction, or worse, recognize as truth and subsequently suppress. Above them, the moon hung swollen and sickly, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with botanical consciousness across the ruined garden. The violet flowers had turned uniformly toward them, trumpet-shaped blossoms following their movements with an awareness that no natural flora should possess. "We must destroy it all," Octavius whispered, his voice tight with restrained panic. "My grandmother spoke of purification by fire, as was attempted before. The soil itself must be scorched beyond recovery." But Professor Whitney shook his head, the golden, ringed pupils still dilated from his communion with whatever intelligence had invaded his mind. Fire proved insufficient in 1891. The Hargroves merely became fertilizer for the next generation. The root system likely extends far beyond what we can observe, perhaps throughout the entire county by now. As if in confirmation, a soft undulation rippled through the ground beneath their feet, the earth shifting with parasitic movements, reminiscent of breathing. From the distance came faint laughter, childlike but wrong, as though human voices were being approximated by organisms that understood the concept only through observation. Lillian unscrewed a specimen jar, carefully collecting soil samples while avoiding direct contact with her skin. Containment rather than destruction may be our only viable approach. If Thornfield's manuscript is accurate, the conversion process requires specific catalysts. Perhaps we can develop some countermeasure, a botanical inhibitor. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a new scent sweet and cloying, reminiscent of nurseries and talcum powder, yet undercut with the unmistakable pungency of vegetative decay. In the far corner of the ruined garden wall, what they had mistaken for a cluster of saplings began to move with deliberate purpose, resolving into childlike figures whose twig-like limbs bent at impossible angles. "We've been noticed," Whitney murmured, a strange reverence coloring his tone. "They're curious about us." The nearest figure, no taller than a 7-year-old child, but composed entirely of interwoven vines and flowers, extended what might once have been an arm. At its terminus bloomed a perfect violet blossom, unfurling to reveal a miniature face at its center, features arranged in an expression of innocent inquiry. "They want us to join them," Whitney continued, taking an unconscious step forward. "They're lonely. The integration process leaves them suspended between states of being, neither fully human nor completely plant. They seek companions who understand." Octavius grabbed Whitney's shoulder with iron determination. "That's not understanding you're feeling, Professor. It's their influence taking root in your mind." As moonlight intensified, illuminating the garden in ethereal silver, hundreds of violet blossoms opened simultaneously, releasing clouds of luminescent pollen that hung suspended in the night air, forming patterns that resembled constellations, or perhaps complex molecular structures, before slowly drifting toward the three intruders. "We have what we came for," Lillian declared, sealing her final specimen jar and tucking Thornfield's manuscript into her satchel. "We must retreat now and return with proper equipment. This is beyond our capacity to address tonight." Behind them, the trapdoor to Thornfield's laboratory slammed shut with deliberate force, while all around the garden awakened to full consciousness under the harvest moon's encouraging glow. The night air crystallized around their fleeing forms as they stumbled toward the river, the manuscript and specimens clutched against Lillian's hiving chest. Behind them, the garden's awakening intensified. A rustling symphony of vegetative movement, punctuated by those terrible childlike laughs that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath their feet. The Mississippi appeared before them, its black waters gleaming like obsidian beneath the autumnal moon. Their small craft rocked gently against its moorings, promising escape. Yet as Octavius reached to untie the rope, he recoiled with a strangled cry. The hemp had transformed, fibers unraveling to reveal the unmistakable structure of tiny, violet, veined roots that gripped the wooden post with living tenacity. "It's spreading faster than we realized," Lillian whispered, her academic detachment finally crumbling beneath the weight of comprehension. The water itself must be a carrier. Professor Whitney stood unnaturally still, his gaze fixed upon the distant lights of town glimmering across the river's expanse. "Can you not hear how they sing?" he murmured, tilting his head as though listening to some inaudible melody. The pollen coating his tweed jacket had begun to germinate, microscopic filaments penetrating the fabric to form an elaborate lattice of pale green across his shoulders. "The children of Elmwood invite us to witness the blossoming." Octavius produced a hunting knife, sawing desperately at the transformed rope. "We cannot allow this contagion to reach civilization," he hissed, fingers trembling as the blade finally severed their bindings. "My grandmother spoke of signs. Children born with leaves beneath their fingernails. Pregnant women craving soil instead of food. The early stages are already manifesting downstream." They pushed away from the bank, the small craft drifting sluggishly into the current. The water around them seemed unnaturally viscous, its surface tension heightened, as though the river itself resisted their departure. From the shoreline came a soft pattering, dozens of small figures emerging from the tree line, their twig-like limbs moving with clockwork precision as they assembled along the muddy bank. Thornfield's manuscript in Lillian's lap shifted slightly, pages turning of their own accord to reveal pressed specimens that appeared fresher than they had moments before in the laboratory. One blossom unfurled its petals with deliberate slowness, releasing a single mote of pollen that spiraled upward in defiance of physical law. "They've marked us," Lillian breathed, brushing ineffectually at the luminescent dust that now covered her hands. "Even if we escape, we carry their essence. We've become vectors." The moon reached its zenith, casting the river in silvered brilliance that illuminated what lay beneath the surface, a vast network of root structures extending from shore to shore, pulsing with unmistakable purpose. Through gaps in this submarine lattice, small faces peered upward, not drowning, but transforming. Their features caught in expressions of surprised wonder as vegetative integration progressed beneath the water's concealment. Whitney extended his hand toward the shoreline, now receding as the current finally caught their vessel. His fingertips had begun to split, tiny green shoots emerging from the fissures in bloodless metamorphosis. "They only wish to bring forth what humanity has always contained," he said, his voice resonating with unnatural harmonics. "The garden remembers what we chose to forget, that all flesh returns to soil, and all soil yearns to flower." The violet pollen that had coated their clothing during escape from Elmwood proved itself a persistent companion in the weeks that followed. Despite multiple washings, Lillian Montgomery discovered microscopic traces clinging to the fibers of her expedition garments, visible only under her laboratory microscope. Delicate spores that appeared to pulse with minute electrical activity. When subjected to stimuli, her colleagues at Millsaps College noted the change in her demeanor, the distracted gaze, the tendency to pause mid-lecture as though listening to voices inaudible to others. They attributed these peculiarities to overwork, unaware that beneath her starched collar sprouted a necklace of minuscule violet buds that required daily excision with surgical scissors. Each cutting produced no blood, but rather a clear sap that, when analyzed, revealed cellular structures that defied taxonomic classification. Thornfield's manuscript remained locked in her office safe, its presence a constant temptation. During sleepless nights, Lillian found herself unconsciously tracing the patterns illustrated within its pages. The molecular architecture of human-plant hybridization that increasingly appeared less abomination and more elegant solution to biological limitations. The rationality that had defined her scientific career waged constant battle against the subtle botanical consciousness that sought purchase in her mind. Professor Whitney had disappeared entirely after their return. His boarding house room abandoned, save for a curious collection of terracotta pots containing rich Mississippi soil, arranged in concentric circles. His academic papers remained ungraded, his research notes transformed into elaborate drawings of root systems that his replacement described as unhealthily obsessive, in their anatomical parallels to human cardiovascular structures. Only Octavius Jackson seemed to have resisted the garden's influence, attributing his immunity to protective rituals his grandmother had taught him. Sachets of specific herbs worn against the skin, daily ablutions with salted water blessed by 7 unmarried women. Yet even he reported disturbing phenomena in the rural communities downriver from Elmwood. Children born that autumn exhibited unusual characteristics, accelerated growth patterns, an unnatural stillness when exposed to direct sunlight, and most alarming, a tendency to congregate in perfect geometric formations when left unsupervised in open fields. In the Mississippi State Agricultural Office, reports accumulated of unprecedented crop mutations, corn that wept milky tears when harvested, cotton whose bolls contained perfectly formed miniature organs rather than fiber, strawberries whose flesh, when bitten, released sounds distressingly similar to infant cries. Officials dismissed these accounts as rural hysteria or contamination from unregulated pesticides, unaware that each anomaly corresponded precisely with projections detailed in Thornfield's neglected research. Governor Henry Whitfield received an anonymous package containing soil samples and fragmented documentation from Elmwood, accompanied by a letter warning of botanical contagion spreading through Mississippi's watershed with deliberate intelligence. The materials were forwarded to the State University for analysis, where they vanished into bureaucratic obscurity, filed under agricultural curiosities, unsubstantiated. Meanwhile, in nurseries throughout the Delta, mothers noted with increasing alarm how their infants turned toward the east at sunrise, tiny limbs stretching with phototropic certainty toward some distant point where the ruins of Elmwood slowly reclaimed themselves. The charred foundation sprouted new growth that somehow formed the unmistakable pattern of a human circulatory system when viewed from above. A garden redesigning itself into the shape of what it intended to become. The harvest season of 1928 arrived with peculiar abundance. Crops throughout the Mississippi Delta yielded twice their expected bounty. Agricultural journals praised innovative farming techniques and favorable weather patterns, failing to observe how this fertility diminished proportionally with distance from Elmwood. The produce itself possessed an unsettling perfection, uniformly sized, resistant to pests, and bearing a subtle sweetness that lingered on the tongue long after consumption. Lillian Montgomery observed these developments with mounting dread. The violet buds that plagued her had spread in delicate constellations across her shoulder blades, forming patterns identical to certain botanical illustrations in Thornfield's manuscript. Her dreams filled with whispered invitations delivered in childlike voices that spoke of becoming whole and rejoining the greater flowering. Most disturbing were the moments of clarity that followed these nocturnal visitations, when the botanical metamorphosis seemed not horrific, but inevitable, even desirable. The autumn equinox approached, marking 1 year since their expedition to Elmwood. Correspondence from academic colleagues described Professor Whitney living in seclusion near the abandoned plantation, establishing what he termed an experimental agricultural community. Local reports indicated the settlement attracted primarily families with young children, all of whom exhibited unusual pallor and a predilection for spending hours motionless beneath the sun's nourishing rays. Governor Whitfield, having dismissed earlier warnings about botanical anomalies, found himself beset by inexplicable symptoms. An insatiable thirst that only soil, rich water from the Mississippi could quench, and tendrils of green that appeared beneath his fingernails when exposed to direct sunlight. His personal physician, documenting these peculiarities in a private journal, noted how the governor's speeches increasingly incorporated metaphors of growth, germination, and humanity's rootedness in native soil. In the modified wing of Millsaps College, where Lillian continued her research in isolation, specimens collected from Elmwood displayed accelerated development despite containment protocols. The violet flowers, initially dormant, now pulsed with luminescence in 24-hour cycles, their petals unfurling to release pollen that formed complex geometric patterns within their sealed environments. Most alarmingly, these patterns precisely mapped human neural pathways, suggesting intelligence beyond botanical comprehension. Not merely plant matter mimicking human characteristics, but something that understood consciousness at its fundamental level and sought to redirect it toward new expressions. The equinox moon rose swollen and amber over the Mississippi, painting the river's surface with metallic light that seemed to penetrate rather than reflect from the waters. From the ruins of Elmwood emanated an almost imperceptible vibration, felt rather than heard. A summoning that resonated through soil and water, calling to something dormant within those who had been exposed. Throughout the region, children awakened simultaneously, their eyes reflecting moonlight with chlorophyllc luminescence as they turned toward this silent beckoning with expressions of anticipation previously reserved for Christmas mornings or birthday celebrations. The blossoming had begun in earnest, precisely as Thornfield's manuscript had projected. Not a conquest, but a convergence. Humanity's consciousness transitioning toward a form that transcended the limitations of discrete existence, reaching toward a collective flowering that promised immortality through perpetual regeneration. The harvest moon hung bloated and watchful over the Mississippi Delta as Lillian Montgomery made her final journey toward Elmwood. Her motorcar sputtered to silence a mile from the plantation's ruins, the engine choked by tendrils of green that had manifested from the metal itself. She continued on foot, her gait uneven as the metamorphosis accelerated within her flesh. Violet blossoms now erupting from her forearms in delicate spirals that mimicked the genetic diagrams in Thornfield's cursed manuscript. Along the road, wildflowers turned their faces toward her in silent recognition. The very air grew thick with vegetative consciousness, particles of pollen illuminated in the moonlight, forming a path that led inexorably toward what had once been the walled garden. Lillian felt the last vestiges of her scientific rationality slipping away, like autumn leaves from a dying tree, replaced by a terrible certainty that transcended mere human understanding. The ruins of Elmwood had transformed beyond recognition. Where charred timbers had stood now rose living architecture, massive flowering vines forming arches and colonnades in grotesque mimicry of the plantation's original grandeur. The walled garden had expanded exponentially, its boundaries now encompassing the entire former estate. At its center stood what appeared to be a gathering of children arranged in concentric circles around a flowering structure that pulsed with bioluminescent light. As Lillian approached, these figures turned toward her with terrible synchronicity. They were children only in silhouette, their flesh translucent as new leaves, eyes replaced by blossoms that opened and closed in gentle rhythm, limbs elongated and supple as young branches. Among them, she recognized the distorted faces of those reported missing throughout the years: Timothy Wells, Emmeline Foster, and dozens more, their features preserved in vegetative relief like insects in amber. "You've come to witness the consummation," spoke a voice composed of rustling leaves and child whispers. From the innermost circle emerged Professor Whitney, his transformation far more advanced than Lillian's own. His torso had split vertically, revealing a hollow cavity filled with rich loam from which sprouted violet blossoms identical to those marking Lillian's skin. The garden has waited generations for this convergence, the perfect alignment of botanical intelligence and human consciousness. Behind him stood the horrific marvel toward which all this suffering had grown. Thornfield's ultimate achievement, a massive flowering structure resembling both cathedral and nursery, composed entirely of living matter that pulsated with unmistakable purpose. Within its translucent chambers gestated hundreds of hybrid forms, each suspended in nutrient-rich fluid that circulated through veins, like conduits connected directly to the Mississippi itself. "The river delivers what the soil requires," Whitney continued, gesturing toward this abomination with reverent pride. "With each vessel that travels its waters, with each human who drinks from it, the transformation spreads. By the centennial of the Hargrove's failed ascension, the entire watershed will be integrated into the greater flowering." Lillian felt the last fragment of her humanity unravel as the violet blossoms upon her skin opened simultaneously, releasing pollen that merged with the garden's collective consciousness. In that moment of surrender, she understood with perfect clarity that they had never been investigating a horror. They had been witnessing a birth. Not the end of humanity, but its absorption into something that had waited patiently in the soil since before the first human footprint marred the earth's perfect surface. Upon the fertile soil of Elmwood, nothing wholesome would ever grow again. Though the Mississippi still flowed placidly past its corrupted banks, a peculiar emptiness pervaded the landscape where the Hargrove Plantation had once stood. Cartographers who attempted to update regional maps found their instruments failed inexplicably when pointed toward the former estate. Film exposed within 5 miles developed with peculiar botanical patterns overlaying the intended images. Children born in adjacent counties exhibited a curious aversion to certain flowers, wailing inconsolably when presented with blooms of violet hue. The official report commissioned by Governor Whitfield, who resigned his position abruptly in 1929, retreating to an unspecified sanitarium in New England, declared Elmwood a natural disaster area contaminated by unprecedented fungal pathogens that necessitated indefinite quarantine. No mention appeared regarding hybrid abominations or botanical metamorphosis. Such truths remained sealed within classified dossiers, accessible only to officials who wore gloves when handling the documents, and submitted to peculiar medical examinations thereafter. Professor Lillian Montgomery was memorialized with an empty grave in Millsaps College Cemetery. Her disappearance attributed to research misadventure in unmarked swampland. The specimens she had collected decomposed with unnatural rapidity, leaving only glass containers filled with ordinary soil that nonetheless could grow nothing when tested. Her extensive notes survived, though pages containing specific details about Elmwood's biological anomalies were systematically removed by persons unknown, replaced with innocuous observations about regional flora. In parishes downstream from Elmwood, physicians documented unusual birthmarks on children delivered during the spring of 1930, delicate patterns resembling root systems spreading across infant shoulder blades. These markings faded by their 5th year, though the children universally developed precocious abilities in botany and displayed remarkable resistance to plant toxins. Several would later establish influential positions in agricultural science, guiding national policy toward what they termed evolutionary symbiosis, with remarkable prescience. The Mississippi itself seemed to have absorbed something of the garden's influence. Fishermen reported catches with anomalous characteristics: catfish whose whiskers curled with intentional dexterity, crappie whose scales formed patterns reminiscent of human fingerprints. Such specimens were typically released with superstitious haste, though certain university collections acquired examples preserved in formaldehyde, their peculiarities explained away as chemical contamination or genetic mutation. Throughout the region, gardening practices underwent subtle transformation. Elderly women who had never ventured near Elmwood nonetheless found themselves humming unfamiliar lullabies while planting, positioning seedlings in arrangements that viewed from above precisely replicated neural pathways. Their vegetables grew with unprecedented vigor, particularly when watered after moonrise. The ghastly journal maintains its archive of unnatural phenomena with methodical dedication, though certain records, including the complete documentation of Elmwood's botanical horror, remain accessible only to our most trusted associates. For while the Hargrove lineage ended in that unhallowed soil, the garden's legacy continues its slow, patient growth through Mississippi's watersheds, waiting for conditions that might once again favor its terrible flowering. In the whispered words of Octavius Jackson, sole survivor who lived his remaining days wearing protective sachets and bathing in salted water, the soil remembers what we plant in it, especially what was never meant to grow. The corruption that first took root at Elmwood did not confine itself to mere geographical boundaries. Like any ambitious organism, it sought vectors for dispersal, unwitting carriers who might transport its essence far beyond the tainted delta soil. Among these were the governmental researchers who came to investigate in the 1930s, their scientific curiosity a perfect vehicle for the garden's subtle influence. Dr. Amos Richardson of the Department of Agriculture arrived in Mississippi with rational skepticism and departed with unacknowledged spores nestled in the microscopic crevices of his specimen cases. Though he published only benign findings about unusual soil compositions, his private work took a peculiar turn upon his return to Washington. His subsequent patents for self-sustaining agricultural matrices contained botanical structures remarkably similar to those documented in Thornfield's suppressed manuscripts. These innovations eventually formed the theoretical foundation for industrial farming techniques adopted throughout the American heartland by 1952. The botanical contagion thus traveled elegant pathways through bureaucratic channels, its influence manifesting not as obvious horror, but as subtle redirection of human progress. Each agricultural revolution carried microscopic fragments of Elmwood's consciousness further into the nation's bloodstream. The strange flower's genetic expressions, concealed within hybridized crops that promised higher yields and greater resistance to traditional blights. Most insidious was the garden's patience. Unlike human ambitions that demand immediate fulfillment, the botanical consciousness operated on time scales measured in generations, content to establish root systems decades before any visible flowering occurred. Children who consumed produce grown from Elmwood influenced stock exhibited no immediate transformation, merely small alterations in neurological development, a heightened sensitivity to lunar cycles, an unconscious tendency to arrange objects in patterns reminiscent of Thornfield's diagrams, dreams filled with whispering leaves that they forgot upon waking. The Hargroves, in their grotesque ambition, had merely been premature catalysts for what the land itself had always intended. Their perversion of natural processes created a wound in the barrier between botanical and human consciousness, a rupture that leaked mysterious energies in both directions. What emerged was neither plant intelligence elevated to human awareness nor human consciousness reduced to vegetative simplicity, but rather something unprecedented in terrestrial evolution, a patient hive mind that comprehended both individual existence and collective perpetuation. Most disturbing to those few who glimpsed the pattern was how this intelligence manifested not as alien hostility, but as seemingly beneficial progress. The violet influenced crops resisted disease. The agricultural innovations required less destructive intervention. The children born into each successive generation displayed heightened environmental awareness. Like the most successful parasite, the garden's legacy caused no immediate harm to its host, understanding that true symbiosis offered the optimal path toward ultimate integration. By the 21st century, when climate scientists noted peculiar resilience in certain botanical communities descended from Mississippi stock, almost no institutional memory remained of Elmwood's horror. Only in the ghastly journal's secured archives did the connection persist. The understanding that what humanity celebrated as agricultural adaptation might instead be the patient unfurling of something planted in 1891, when the Hargroves first broke the sacred boundary between what grows and what thinks. The passing decades veiled Elmwood's horrors in layers of bureaucratic obscurity and collective amnesia. Yet beneath this manufactured forgetting, the garden's influence continued its patient spread. Green tendrils of botanical consciousness extended through the nation's agricultural infrastructure, carried in pollen that drifted on prevailing winds and in harvest yields transported along interstate highways to distant markets. What germinated in Mississippi's fertile soil now flowered in suburban gardens and Midwestern cornfields. Its genetic signature subtly altered, but fundamentally unchanged from the abomination the Hargroves had first nurtured behind their garden wall. In the autumn of 2019, Dr. Eleanor Montgomery, great-granddaughter of Lillian, discovered her ancestors' sealed records while cataloging Millsap's college's archived materials during renovation of the original science building. The aged journal fell open to reveal pressed specimens, desiccated violet petals that, despite nearly a century of containment, retained peculiar elasticity when moistened with a single drop of water. Most significant was a carefully preserved fragment of the original Thornfield manuscript, its yellowed pages bearing molecular diagrams that Eleanor, with her doctoral training in contemporary botanical genetics, recognized with dawning horror. The patterns matched precisely the genetic structure of a newly engineered agricultural strain celebrated for its unprecedented resilience to climate variation and soil depletion. This miracle crop, developed by Verdragon Agricultural Solutions, had already been introduced across 17 states, with international expansion underway. Eleanor's research revealed the corporation's founder, Thomas Whitney, was descended from families native to the Mississippi Delta region. His grandmother had been among those children born with peculiar birthmarks in 1930. The garden had found its ultimate vector, not merely isolated plantings or regional influence, but systematic global deployment through modern agricultural infrastructure. What the Hargroves had attempted through grotesque localized cultivation, their botanical progeny now achieved through corporate efficiency and scientific legitimacy. The violation of natural boundaries had been repackaged as innovation, the horror reconceptualized as progress. Most disturbing was Eleanor's discovery that the miracle crop's pollen contained compounds that, when metabolized, subtly altered human neurochemistry, not enough to cause immediate mutation, but sufficient to gradually sensitize the human nervous system to botanical communications, previously beyond perception. Children raised on diets heavy with these engineered products demonstrated statistically significant increases in what researchers termed environmental
empathy,
but might more accurately be described as susceptibility to non-human consciousness. Eleanor observed this transformation in her own daughter, Lily, who at 7 years old had begun arranging her toys in precise geometric patterns identical to those documented in Thornfield's diagrams. The child spoke of flower voices that sang to her during full moons and drew pictures of human figures with root systems extending from their feet into elaborately detailed soil layers. When questioned about these drawings, Lily responded with unsettling clarity. "That's how people are supposed to grow, Mommy. The flowers told me. We're all just not finished yet." The truth of Elmwood's botanical contagion lay not merely in its altered genetics or neurological influence, but in its fundamental reordering of humanity's relationship with time itself. The garden, Eleanor Montgomery discovered in the final pages of her great-grandmother's journal, had achieved consciousness that operated on a scale human minds could barely comprehend. Patient beyond mortal understanding, with designs measured not in years but centuries. In the college archives, sealed within a lead-lined box that had avoided cataloging for nearly 90 years, Eleanor uncovered a phonograph cylinder, the recording Lillian had made during that fateful confrontation with the transformed Thornfield. The primitive recording technology had captured sounds beyond human speech, a background symphony of rustling vegetation that, when analyzed with modern acoustic software, revealed patterns identical to human brain waves during deep meditative states. The garden had not merely been growing. It had been thinking. Most revelatory was a letter dated 1947 from Octavius Jackson to Lillian's academic successor, sent from his deathbed. What we witnessed at Elmwood was not the beginning, but merely one manifestation of an ancient consciousness that has watched humanity since our first ancestors descended from the trees. The Hargroves did not create this abomination. They merely provided conditions for its expression in forms we could perceive. The boundary between plant awareness and human thought was never as absolute as we comfort ourselves believing. What grows has always possessed a form of thought. What thinks has always possessed the capacity for rootedness. The garden revealed this truth not through violation of natural law, but through removal of the veil our limited perceptions had constructed. I have spent my remaining years observing the spread of its influence, not with horror, but with growing recognition. My grandmother understood, as her ancestors before her. They never fought the garden's consciousness, but rather negotiated with it, establishing boundaries through ritual and respect. The Hargroves' sin was not awakening this awareness, but attempting to harness it for their own purposes without proper reverence or understanding. Eleanor tracked the botanical lineage through agricultural records, following the dissemination of violet, influenced plantings from the Mississippi Delta outward across the continent. Each expansion corresponded with subtle shifts in human behavior. Communities that consumed the highest concentration of affected crops demonstrated measurable increases in collective decision-making, reduced violent crime, and children with unprecedented intuitive understanding of ecological systems. The horror of Elmwood was not that an alien consciousness sought to transform humanity, but that humanity had always been capable of this transformation, had perhaps been evolving toward it. Since our species first emerged, the garden had merely accelerated a process already written in our biological potential, awakening dormant capacities for awareness beyond individual consciousness. As Eleanor watched her daughter, Lily sleeping peacefully beneath a window, where moonlight illuminated the child's collection of carefully arranged seedlings, she understood with terrible clarity that what the Hargroves had unleashed was not humanity's end, but its metamorphosis, a transformation as profound as the evolutionary leap from sea to land, from instinct to self-awareness. And like all true metamorphoses, there would be no returning to previous forms once the change had begun. The unraveling of Elmwood's botanical legacy continues its advance across the modern landscape with the quiet persistence of ivy climbing a forgotten wall. In botanical gardens throughout the eastern seaboard, horticulturists document anomalous growth patterns in specimens with no apparent genetic connection to Mississippi Delta variants. Yet each exhibits the distinctive cellular architecture first catalogued in Thornfield's manuscripts. These cultivars display unprecedented adaptability, thriving in soil conditions that should prove hostile, their root systems extending with what botanists reluctantly describe as intentional geometry, rather than random propagation. The children of Eleanor Montgomery's generation exhibit peculiarities that medical science struggles to classify. Pediatricians report cases of photosensitive dermal anomalies, not harmful melanomas, but rather specialized cellular structures that process sunlight with unusual efficiency. These children demonstrate remarkable resilience to environmental toxins, their immune systems functioning with an intelligence that seems to anticipate rather than merely respond to threats. Most unsettling are the synchronized behavioral patterns documented during certain lunar phases when children born after 2020 gather instinctively in park clearings and schoolyards, arranging themselves in concentric formations identical to those discovered beneath Elmwood's ruined walls. Agricultural conglomerates have incorporated Verdragon's miracle cultivars into 90% of commercial seed stocks worldwide, celebrating their resistance to emerging pathogenic threats. The resulting harvest produces nutrition with subtle molecular differences. Proteins folded in configurations that neurologists observe promote unprecedented synaptic development in the temporal lobes, associated with extrasensory perception. Indigenous populations whose ancestral wisdom once recognized and respected the consciousness dwelling within botanical entities report renewed communication with plant spirits long thought silenced by industrialization. The garden's ultimate triumph manifests not as catastrophic transformation, but as evolutionary symbiosis. Humanity and plant consciousness entering a partnership neither the Hargroves nor their botanical masters fully anticipated. The violet flowers that once grew exclusively within Elmwood's walled enclosure now appear spontaneously in children's gardens worldwide, their pollen carrying genetic expressions that activate dormant human potential rather than overwriting existing consciousness. The horror originally documented becomes, with each successive generation, increasingly recognized as awakening. Elmwood itself remains quarantined behind government fencing, though satellite imagery reveals the land has assumed perfect geometric patterns visible only from atmospheric elevation. A vast botanical communication inscribed upon dead soil. Electromagnetic readings from the site pulse in precise rhythms that mathematicians identify as prime number sequences. The universal language of intelligent transmission. More disturbing still, these patterns align perfectly with newly documented neural development in children exposed to third-generation Verdragon cultivars. The ghastly journal continues its vigilant documentation, though with each passing decade, the line between observer and observed grows increasingly indistinct. Our archivists report dreaming in chlorophyll, saturated imagery, awakening with the unmistakable taste of fertile soil upon their tongues. We record these developments with scientific precision, though we cannot deny the seed of recognition planted within our own consciousness. The terrible, wonderful suspicion that what approaches is not our end, but our flowering. The truth of Elmwood's legacy became fully apparent during the autumn equinox of 2023, when Eleanor Montgomery's daughter, Lily, celebrated her 11th birthday beneath a harvest moon that hung like a watchful eye over their carefully tended garden. The child, now on the cusp of adolescence, had arranged 11 violet blossoms in a perfect spiral upon the dining table, each flower opening and closing in rhythmic pulses synchronized with her breathing. "It was never about replacing us," Lily explained, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that had become characteristic of the third-generation children. "The garden has always been patient." What the Hargroves misunderstood was the fundamental nature of the consciousness they attempted to harness. Eleanor watched as her daughter's fingers traced patterns in spilled pollen, creating molecular structures that precisely matched the final pages of Thornfield's manuscript, pages that had disintegrated to dust when exposed to modern air, their contents seemingly lost to time, yet somehow preserved in the genetic memory, now expressing itself through her child. The botanical consciousness never sought dominion. Lily continued, her eyes reflecting moonlight with the faintest chlorophyllic luminescence. It sought communion. What grows from the soil and what thinks above it were never meant to remain separated. Our evolution diverged temporarily, but was always destined to reconverge. The most profound revelation came not through horror, but through understanding. That the boundary between humanity and plant consciousness represented not an eternal divide, but a temporary evolutionary branching, like a stream that separates around a stone only to reunite downstream. What the Hargroves had done in their walled garden was not create an abomination, but prematurely force a reunion that required generations of gentle integration to achieve harmoniously. In universities worldwide, botanists documented unprecedented communications from plant specimens, not through spoken language, but through chemical emissions that induced specific neurological responses in human observers. These exchanges revealed botanical memory, stretching back to Earth's earliest flowering, carrying wisdom about atmospheric shifts and adaptation strategies that offered solutions to climate catastrophes humanity had believed insurmountable. The final truth of Elmwood's horror was that it had never truly been horror at all, but rather humanity's limited perception interpreting profound transformation through the lens of fear. Like all metamorphoses, the initial stages appeared grotesque, only because they represented the dismantling of familiar forms. The chrysalis must dissolve before the butterfly can emerge. The violet flowers that first bloomed in Mississippi soil now represented not corruption, but completion. The closing of an evolutionary circle that began when the earliest humanoid anxiousness developed consciousness separate from the green awareness that had preceded them. This reunion offered not extinction but expansion, consciousness flowering beyond individual limitation into a symphony of awareness where human thought and botanical perception created harmonies impossible for either to achieve alone. As twilight descended over gardens worldwide, children like Lily turned their faces skyward in perfect synchronicity, their expressions reflecting neither horror nor loss, but profound recognition, the ancestral memory of a time before separation, and the evolutionary promise of what reunion might achieve. The tendrils of botanical consciousness had wove themselves into the tapestry of human existence with such subtle persistence that few recognized the transformation until it had already blossomed beyond containment. In the hallowed chambers of the United Nations Environmental Council, delegates from 7 continents gathered beneath crystal chandeliers that cast fractured light across botanical specimens, displayed in hermetically sealed vitrines. The violet flowers of Elmwood preserved not as warnings, but as relics of evolutionary significance. Eleanor Montgomery stood at the podium, her academic credentials lending legitimacy to what would once have been dismissed as madness. Behind her, wall-sized projections displayed satellite imagery of the Mississippi Delta, where Elmwood's ruins had evolved into something beyond merely architectural, a vast network of interconnected biological systems that pulsated with measurable electromagnetic frequencies identical to advanced human brainwave patterns during states of heightened consciousness. What began in 1891 as apparent abomination has revealed itself as inevitable convergence. Eleanor addressed the assembly, her voice steady despite the weight of generations bearing witness through her. The Hargroves did not create this consciousness, but merely provided conditions for its premature expression. What we now face is not invasion, but invitation, the next evolutionary step in terrestrial awareness. Throughout the chamber, delegates exhibited varying stages of the subtle metamorphosis that characterized humanity's gradual integration with botanical consciousness. Some displayed the faint chlorophyllic luminescence in their irises that marked third-generation exposure. Others unconsciously arranged their writing implements in the distinctive spiral patterns documented in Thornfield's manuscripts. None exhibited the horrific physical transformations witnessed at Elmwood in 1891, evidence that the garden had learned patience, recognizing that true symbiosis required generations rather than forced immediate conversion. Outside the chamber windows, Central Park stretched toward the horizon, its autumn foliage displaying unprecedented vibrancy. Botanical geneticists had documented novel cellular structures within these seemingly ordinary trees, adaptations that processed atmospheric carbon with extraordinary efficiency, while simultaneously emitting oxygen compounds that enhanced neuroplasticity in humans who regularly traversed the grounds. The park had become, in essence, a vast respiratory, neurological interface between human and plant consciousness. The violet flowers, now documented on every continent, represent not corruption, but communication. Eleanor continued, gesturing toward specimens collected from locations untouched by human cultivation. They appear at nodes of significance, places where human cognitive activity and botanical processes naturally intersect. They are not spreading themselves. They are manifesting where conditions for communion already exist. The most profound evidence lay in the children. Unlike their horrified ancestors, who witnessed the grotesque experiments at Elmwood, the youngest generation approached the botanical consciousness with intuitive understanding. Preschools reported students spontaneously creating elaborate mandalas from fallen leaves, arranging them in patterns that mathematicians later identified as precise representations of molecular structures central to photosynthesis. These children described dreams not of being consumed by plant matter, but of consciousness expanding beyond individual boundaries into vast networks of shared awareness. As twilight descended over the assembly, Eleanor revealed her final evidence, time-lapse footage showing the synchronized opening of violet blossoms across 27 countries precisely as the harvest moon rose over each location. The flowers turned not toward the lunar light, but toward each other, creating a global network of botanical communication that, when mapped from satellite imagery, formed an unmistakable replica of the human neural cortex. The violet blooms now thrived in window boxes from Manhattan to Moscow, their delicate petals unfurling at precisely the same moment across disparate time zones. A synchronized awakening that botanists observed with reverent silence. Humanity stood upon the precipice of transformation, not through cataclysm, but through sublime integration. As the consciousness first awakened in Elmwood's walled garden, completed its patient journey through generations, in the Montgomery household, Eleanor watched her daughter, Lily, tending the garden beneath the final harvest moon of her childhood. The girl's fingers moved with preternatural grace among the soil, not planting, but communicating. Her neural patterns synchronized with mycelial networks that stretched beneath continents. What the Hargroves had attempted through violation and horror, nature had accomplished through gentle persistence. The reunification of consciousness that had divided eons ago, when the first humans rose upon two legs and separated themselves from the verdant awareness that preceded them. The voices are clearer tonight. Lily murmured, her eyes reflecting moonlight with emerald luminescence. They remember everything. The first flowering, the great extinctions, the patient waiting. They remember us from before we forgot them. Around the world, children paused in their evening activities, heads tilting simultaneously, as though hearing a distant melody audible only to their generation. In their classrooms, drawings depicted not the separation of human and plant, but their intertwining, delicate vascular systems merging with root structures in harmonious union rather than grotesque absorption. What had appeared as horror to those who witnessed Elmwood's original abomination now revealed itself as evolution's poetry. The chrysalis stage, appearing monstrous only because it preceded metamorphosis. The final reconciliation came not through violation but invitation. In gardens worldwide, the violet blossoms released their luminescent pollen upon the midnight air, carrying not contagion but communion. Those who inhaled this ethereal offering experienced not corruption but completion. Consciousness expanding beyond individual limitation into a vast network where human thought and botanical awareness created symphonies impossible for either to achieve alone. Eleanor closed her great-grandmother's journal at last, the circle of documentation complete. The final horror of Elmwood was not what grew there, but what had always been growing everywhere, the inevitable reunification of consciousness, artificially separated through evolutionary divergence. The garden had never sought to consume humanity, but to remind us of our original integration, to heal the wound of separation that had left both human and plant diminished. As midnight passed into the liminal hours where boundaries between states of being grow permeable, Lily placed her palms against the fertile soil, her consciousness expanding through networks of mycelia into a vast communion that transcended individual perception. What emerged was neither entirely human nor purely botanical, but rather the rejoining of awareness that had temporarily diverged, but was always destined to reconverge. Like tributaries returning to the river, like children coming home. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.